Welcome, everyone, to our fun little study group for PP 5375. That's Economic Analysis for Public Policy and Management.
Glad you could join us.
So for weeks now, we've really been getting into the weeds of consumer theory. You know, what people want, their budgets, how they try to maximize satisfaction.
All that good stuff on the demand side.
Exactly. But today, we are completely flipping the economic table.
We are.
We're tackling the supply side, specifically diving into the core readings for Section '06, which is all about production and production costs.
This is where we shift focus to what's called the theory of the firm. And our mission, really, is to understand the producer. Now, that could be a huge corporation, sure, but it could also be a small, nonprofit clinic, maybe even a city utility department.
Right, any entity that's making something or providing a service.
Precisely. We need to figure out how these organizations take inputs, labor, materials, capital, and turn them into outputs efficiently, minimizing the drain on resources.
Yeah.
It's crucial for both private and public sectors.
And we're not just winging it. We're guided today by quite a stack of technical sources that really lay out the whole analytical architecture for this.
That's right. We're working mainly from the core materials for this section. So we'll be drawing quite a bit from those excerpts we've labeled 000PIND1.pdf and 0000PIND2.pdf.
Okay.
And we're also pulling in the critical synthesis from our lecture notes. That's '08 Notes Theory of the Firm Production, lun.pdf. And looking at some helpful visuals in the presentation deck, '09 PPTX Theory of the Firm 3.pdf.
Got it. So the goal here isn't just, memorizing definitions. It's about building a toolkit, something managers and policy analysts can actually use.
Exactly.
We need to understand the mechanics, like how does a manager, say, planning a new factory layout or maybe deciding on staffing for a public health program, how do they actually make these cost-minimizing decisions?
And what's really critical to grasp right off the bat is how closely the firm's decision-making process mirrors the consumer's optimization problem we've already covered.
Okay, so there's a parallel.
A very strong parallel. It makes these concepts pretty analogous, actually.
Okay, so let's refresh. The consumer had, what, 3 steps? Understanding preferences, figuring out their budget constraint, and then maximizing satisfaction within that budget.
Perfect. The firm does essentially the same thing, just using slightly different language.
All right, step 1 for the firm then.
Step 1 is the production technology. This is sort of the equivalent of consumer preferences. It's the hard science, the engineering reality of how inputs, labor, capital, raw materials can physically be transformed into outputs.
Okay, so like if you're building 10,000 TVs, what's physically possible? Hand assembly versus a fully automated factory, that kind of thing.
Exactly. That's your technology constraint. It defines what's feasible. Then step 2 is the cost constraints.
Instead of a fixed income like the consumer.
Right. The firm faces market prices for its input. A price for labor, the wage rate, JW, and a price for capital, often called the rental rate. They need to figure out how to hit a specific output target using the combination of inputs that cost the least amount of money.
Minimize the total cost.
Minimize total cost for a given output. And that leads directly to step 3, the input choice.
Okay.
Given the technology available, and given those input prices, the firm chooses the optimal mix of labor and capital, the specific combination that produces the desired output level for the absolute lowest possible cost.
Technology costs choice.
That 3-step process, understanding the technology, facing the cost constraints, making the optimal input choice, that's really the bedrock of the supply side.
Okay, let's really unpack that first step then, the production technology, and maybe start with a question that sounds a bit philosophical, but it has huge economic weight. Why do firms even exist? Why aren't we all just, independent contractors negotiating everything?
That's a great starting point. It takes us right back to the economist Ronald Coase and his really revolutionary question back in 1937. I mean, historically, production was much more fragmented. You had the blacksmith, the farmer, the weaver, all working more or less independently. These modern, large, integrated firms with separate managers and owners, they're actually pretty new, historically speaking, mostly post-mid-1800s, post-industrial revolution.
So Coase asked.
He asked, look, if markets are supposedly so great at allocating resources efficiently, why do we even need these big organizations called firms? Why don't we just rely on the market for everything? Constant negotiation between individuals for every little task.
And when you think about it like that, the inefficiency becomes obvious pretty quickly. Imagine trying to build, say, a car.
Right.
If every single step, stamping the metal, designing the engine part, assembling the dashboard, required a separate contract negotiation with an independent specialist.
It would be chaos. The transaction cost, just the time spent bargaining, writing contracts, enforcing quality, resolving disputes, would be absolutely astronomical.
Production would grind to a halt. It would be slow, probably low quality, and incredibly expensive.
Precisely. Covey's big insight was that firms exist because they offer a much better coordination mechanism for many types of production. Inside a firm, you have managers who can direct salaried workers. You skip the constant need for market negotiation for every single task.
So the firm structure allows goods and services to be produced far more efficiently than relying purely on market transactions for everything.
That's the core idea. The internal coordination efficiency outweighs the costs of, having managers and bureaucracy, at least up to a certain point.
Yeah.
And that efficiency, the potential for production, is formally described by the production function.
Okay, the formula.
Yeah, the basic form is often written as Q ecology equals FK L door. It's really just a mathematical description, a map, like you said earlier.
Right.
It tells you the highest possible output that a firm can produce for every specified combination of inputs. We usually simplify inputs down to capital and labor for teaching purposes, but obviously real firms use many more.
And there's a crucial nuance here, right? This function assumes.
It assumes two things. One, the firm is operating technically efficiently, meaning they're not being wasteful or mismanaging things. They're getting the absolute most output possible from those inputs. If they're inefficient, they're operating inside the frontier defined by the function, below their potential.
And the second assumption.
It applies to a given state of technology. If technology improves, the whole function shifts. You can get more output from the same inputs.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, before we dive deeper into inputs, there's this critical distinction that shapes everything else. The time horizons. Short run versus long run.
Yes, and this trips people up sometimes. It's absolutely fundamental.
Because it's not about a specific amount of time, like 1 year.
Exactly. It has nothing to do with calendar time per se. It's all about flexibility and changing your inputs. The short run is defined as any period of time during which at least one factor of production is fixed.
Fixed meaning you just can't change it quickly.
Right. Think about a factory building or some very large specialized piece of machinery. Those things are often fixed in the short run. You can't just double your factory size tomorrow.
So what can you change in the short run?
You can usually change the intensity with which you use the fixed factors. You can hire more workers, run extra shifts, maybe buy more raw materials. You're varying the variable inputs around the fixed ones.
And the long run?
The long run is defined as the time horizon over which all inputs become variable. Everything is flexible. You can build a new factory. You can install completely different machinery. You can change your entire scale of operation.
And how long that takes really depends on the industry.
Massively. Our sources mention this. The long run for a lemonade stand might be, a day or two. You can get a bigger cart pretty easily.
Yeah.
But for a petrochemical producer or a power plant, the long run might be 5, 10, even 15 years, because building that kind of capital takes ages.
Okay, so let's start with the short run analysis, where we assume capital is fixed. Say we have a factory with a fixed amount of equipment, maybe 10 units of capital. The only thing we can change is the amount of labor we hire.
Right. And when we do that, we need to track how output changes. There are 3 key measures.
First is just the total amount produced.
Exactly. The total product of labor, TPL.
Mm-hmm.
That's simply the total output produced at different levels of labor input, holding capital fixed. You hire 1 worker, you get X output. Hire 2, get Y output, and so on.
Then we have the average product of labor, APL.
Which is just total output divided by the total labor input.
Yeah.
This is the measure people often mean when they talk about overall workforce productivity, output per worker.
Okay. And the third one?
This is often the most important one for making decisions at the margin, the marginal product of labor.
Marginal meaning additional.
Precisely. It's the additional output you get from adding 1 more unit of labor, delta Q, delta LY. So if you currently have 5 workers, the MPLNE tells you exactly how much extra output hiring the 6th worker would generate.
And the relationship between these 3 is really important. Let's walk through the example from Table 6.1 in the Pindyke text, assuming K is fixed at 10.
Okay. So initially, as you add workers, say going from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, total output, TPLA, increases quite rapidly.
And the marginal product, MPL'd all of those first few workers, is high.
Often, yes. And it might even increase initially. Why? Because with more workers, you can achieve specialization. One person focuses on task A, another on task B. They become more efficient than one person trying to do everything.
So MPLers can rise at first, What about average product?
APLA. Well, there's a strict mathematical link. As long as the marginal product of the next worker you add, MPLL, is greater than the current average product, APL of all existing workers, the average must be pulled up.
Makes sense. Adding someone more productive than average raises the average.
Right. So in the example, up to little and Ella guys is above ABLR, and APL is rising.
But then what happens?
But eventually, you start running into the fixed factor constraint. The factory space, the number of machines, it gets crowded. The benefits of specialization diminish. The marginal product of the next worker added starts to fall.
This is the famous law coming into play.
We're getting there. So MPL law starts to decline, and eventually the MPL will fall below the APLA. When the marginal worker is less productive than the current average, they start dragging the average down.
So APL starts to fall after del for our in the example.
Correct. And logically, the MPL dollar must intersect the APL dollar exactly at the point where APL law reaches its maximum. That's point E in figure 6.1.
Okay. And what happens if you keep adding labor even after MPL starts falling?
Total product, TPL still rises for a while as long as MPL is positive. Each additional worker is adding something, just less than the previous one. But eventually you add so many workers relative to the fixed capital that they literally start getting in each other's way.
The marginal product becomes zero.
It hits zero. In the table, this happens around OLR, where total output peaks at $112.2. Adding the ninth worker actually causes total output to fall. Their MPLers is negative. They're counterproductive.
So hiring beyond OOA makes absolutely no economic sense.
None whatsoever. You're paying more wages for less output, which brings us, as you said, to that universal principle.
The law of diminishing marginal returns.
Yes. It states that as you increase the use of one input, like labor, in equal increments, holding other inputs, like capital fixed, the resulting additions to output, delta Q, the marginal product, will eventually decrease.
Eventually is the key word there. It might rise initially due to specialization.
Correct. But eventually the fixed factor becomes a bottleneck. Too many cooks in a fixed-size kitchen, too many workers trying to use a fixed number of machines. It's a physical constraint as much as an economic one.
And this law had some pretty significant historical predictions tied to it.
Oh, absolutely. The classic example is Thomas Malthus back in the late 18th, early 19th century.
The population guy.
Right. He looked at the fixed supply of land, a fixed input, and the growing population, providing labor. Applying the law of diminishing marginal returns, he predicted that food production, output, would inevitably increase more slowly than population.
Leading to
mass starvation, famine, misery. A pretty grim outlook.
But obviously that didn't happen on the scale he predicted. Why not?
Because, as our sources point out, like in example 6.2 and figure 6.2, Malthus didn't fully account for technological change. The law of diminishing returns applies to a given technology.
Ah, so the production function itself can shift.
Exactly. Over time, we developed better fertilizers, genetically engineered seeds, mechanization like tractors, all sorts of technological improvements. Each of these shifted the entire total product curve upward.
So even though diminishing returns might still apply on that new higher curve if you just kept adding labor with the new technology, the overall level of output achievable was vastly greater than Malthus imagined.
Precisely. It's a crucial lesson. Technology can overcome the limitations of fixed factors, at least for a time. Investment in R&D, innovation. That's how societies push back against diminishing returns.
Okay, so that's the short run, dominated by that fixed factor and diminishing returns. Now let's make the jump to the long run in section 2. Here, everything is variable. Both labor and capital can be adjusted.
Right. Now, the firm isn't just deciding how intensely to use its existing plan. It's deciding the fundamental recipe, the very mix of inputs it wants to use, the scale and type of operation.
And the tool we use to visualize this choice is the isoquant.
Exactly. Think of the name. Iso means equal, quant means quantity. An isoquant is simply a curve that shows all the possible combinations of two inputs, typically K and L, that yield the exact same level of output.
So it's the producer's version of the consumer's indifference curve.
Perfect analogy. Just like an indifference curve shows combinations yielding the same utility, an isoquant shows combinations yielding the same output.
And if you draw a whole family of these curves on one graph,
you get an isoquant map. This map represents the firm's entire production function, its technology. Each curve corresponds to a different output level, and output increases as you move northeast on the map. Using more of both inputs generally gets you more output. You can see this in table 6.4 and figure 6.5 in the readings.
Can we still see diminishing returns reflected in these isoquants?
We can in a couple of ways. First, notice the isoquants are typically drawn as convex, bowed inward toward the origin.
Okay, why is that?
It reflects the fact that substitution isn't perfect. If you have a lot of capital and very little labor, labor is highly productive at the margin. You can give up quite a bit of capital if you add one worker and keep output constant. The isoquant is steep.
Makes sense.
But as you move down the isoquant, adding more and more labor and giving up capital, you reach a point where you have lots of labor and little capital.
Yeah.
Now that fixed capital, even though it's variable in the long run for this level of output it feels fixed, becomes the bottleneck again. Adding yet more labor doesn't help as much. It becomes less productive relative to capital.
So you need to give up less and less capital to compensate for each additional unit of labor.
Exactly. That isoquant becomes flatter. This reflects diminishing returns to substituting one input for another along a given output level. And the measure of this slope is critical.
That's the marginal rate of technical substitution, the MRTS.
Right. The MRTS measures the amount by which the input of capital delta K can be reduced when one extra unit of labor, delta LDO, is used, while keeping output constant. It's defined as the negative of the slope of the isoquant. MRTS, delta K, delta LDO.
So it tells you the trade-off rate between inputs, technically speaking.
Precisely. How many machines can you swap out for one worker, technically, without changing your production level?
And you said the isoquants are convex, bowed inward. What does that imply about the MRTS?
It implies diminishing MRTS. As you substitute more and more labor for capital, moving down along the isoquant, the MRTS falls. Labor becomes less effective as a substitute for capital, because production usually requires a balanced mix of inputs. If you try to run a factory with almost all labor and hardly any machines, or vice versa, it becomes very inefficient. The inputs are most productive when used together in some reasonable proportion, which varies by industry and technology.
Is there a link between MRTS and the marginal products we talked about earlier?
Absolutely. There's a direct mathematical relationship. The MRTS between labor and capital is always equal to the ratio of their marginal products. MRTS equals MPL MPKDO.
Ah, okay. So the slope of the isoquant just reflects the relative physical productivity of the two inputs at that particular point.
Exactly. If labor is currently twice as productive at the margin as capital, MPL equals 2 times MTK2, then the MRTS will be 2. You can replace 2 units of capital with 1 unit of labor and keep output the same.
Makes sense. Now, are there situations where this smooth, convex substitution doesn't apply? Special cases?
Definitely. The readings highlight 2 important extremes, shown in figure 6.7 and 6.8. First, you can have perfect substitutes.
Like perfect substitute goods for consumers.
Similar idea. Here, the inputs are perfectly interchangeable at a constant rate. The isoquants are straight lines, meaning the MRTS is constant.
Example.
Maybe certain tasks could be done equally well by, say, 1 sophisticated machine or by 5 workers using simpler tools. And that 1-to-5 ratio holds true regardless of how many machines or workers you already have. The trade-off never changes.
Okay. And the other extreme?
The fixed proportions production function, sometimes called a Leontief function after Wassily-Leontief. Here, the isoquants are L-shaped, just like in difference curves for perfect complements.
Meaning no substitution is possible at all.
None. To get more output, you absolutely must increase the inputs in a specific fixed ratio. Adding more of just one input does nothing for output.
Like needing exactly one driver for one truck.
Perfect example. Or think about baking a cake. You need a fixed ratio of flour and eggs based on the recipe. Adding more flour without more eggs doesn't give you more cake. For that specific output level, adding more of one input gives you 0 marginal product if the other is fixed.
This seems relevant for manufacturing or processes with strict recipes.
Very much so. Chemical production, assembly lines requiring specific worker-machine pairings, things like that often approximate fixed proportions.
The readings also had that interesting example about wheat production using machinery versus labor.
Yes, that was insightful. A farm manager calculated their MRTS and found it was 0.04.
Meaning
MRTS equals delta K, delta L equals 0.044. To keep output constant, if they reduced machine hours, delta K by 1 unit, they'd need to increase labor hours, delta L by 1.04 equals 205 hours.
Wow. So 1 hour machine time was technically equivalent to 25 hours of labor.
Technically, yes, at their current operating point.
Yeah.
So unless labor was dirt cheap, specifically more than 25 times cheaper per hour than running the machinery.
Which is highly unlikely.
Exactly. The manager should immediately realize they are using way too much labor relative to capital. The economically sensible thing to do, the cost-minimizing thing, is to invest heavily in more machinery and substitute away from labor. That MRTS calculation gives them crucial strategic direction.
Okay, that technical foundation, the production function, isoquants, MRTS, sets the stage perfectly for the next critical piece. Money. The costs. We're moving into section 3, focusing on how economists define and measure cost. And this is often quite different from how accountants see it, right?
Very different, and it's a crucial distinction for good decision-making. Accounting cost is generally retrospective. It looks backward at explicit historical expenses. Money actually paid out, depreciation calculated according to tax rules, useful for reporting past performance.
But economic costs.
Economic cost is forward-looking. It's concerned with the cost of utilizing scarce resources in production. It focuses on the cost managers can actually control and that are relevant for future decisions. And the absolute core concept here is opportunity cost.
The cost of the next best alternative forgone.
Exactly. The economic cost of using any resource, your time, your money, a building you own, is the value it would have generated in its best alternative use. This means economic costs often include implicit costs, where no money changes hands.
Give us an example.
Okay, classic one. A firm owns its office building outright. No mortgage, no rent payments. The accountant might report the cost of the building space as zero, or maybe just some depreciation.
But the economist does.
The economist says, what could you do with that building if you weren't using it? Maybe you could rent it out to another company for $100,000 a year. That $100,000 in foregone rent is the opportunity cost of using the building yourself. It's a very real economic cost, even though it doesn't appear in the accounting books as an expense.
This seems especially relevant for government and nonprofits using assets they own.
Hugely relevant. A city owning prime downtown land for a parking lot. The opportunity cost might be the millions in property taxes or lease revenue foregone by not allowing development. That needs to be factored into decisions.
What about, say, inventory? Something you bought a while ago.
Good one. Suppose a firm bought $1 million worth of raw materials last year. Today, due to market changes, those same materials are worth $1.5 million if they sold them. If the firm decides to use those materials in production today, the economic cost is not the $1 million they originally paid.
It's the $1.5 million they could get by selling?
Exactly. It's the opportunity cost, the $1.5 million foregone by using it instead of selling it. Economic decisions should always be based on current values and current alternatives.
Okay, opportunity cost is key. Now, what about costs that should be ignored?
Ah, yes. Sunk costs. A sunk cost is an expenditure that has already been made and, crucially, cannot be recovered.
Cannot get it back no matter what.
Right. Think of money spent on highly specialized equipment that has no resale value or alternative use. Or maybe R&D spending on a project that failed. Once that money is spent, it's gone. It's sunk.
And the rule for decision-making.
The rule is ironclad. Sunk costs should always be ignored when making future economic decisions. Why? Because their opportunity cost is zero. You can't get the money back. So it has no bearing on the costs or benefits of choices you make now. Don't cry over spilled milk, basically.
But people fall into this trap all the time, right? The "we've already spent so much we have to finish it" fallacy.
Constantly. The source material, example 7.1, gives the classic Northwestern Law School example. They were deciding whether to move from their valuable downtown Chicago location.
And the argument for staying was?
Part of the argument was that they already owned the downtown land. The cost was sunk decades ago, so staying was cost-effective.
Ignoring the opportunity cost.
Massively ignoring it. The opportunity cost was the enormous amount of money they could have made by selling that prime lakeshore real estate. That foregone revenue was the true economic cost of staying, regardless of the historical sunk cost of acquiring the land. It was likely a terrible economic decision based on sunk cost fallacy.
Okay, so sunk costs are ignored. How do they relate to fixed costs? People often confuse them.
It's an easy confusion, but the difference is important. Fixed costs are costs that do not vary with the level of output in the short run. Think of rent on a factory, basic utilities, salaries of top management. You have to pay these whether you produce 10 units or 1,000 units as long as you're operating.
Aye.
But critically, you can eliminate fixed costs if you shut down the business entirely. You can break the lease, maybe with a penalty, but the ongoing cost stops. You can lay off the managers. Fixed costs are avoidable if you cease operations.
Whereas sunk costs.
Sunk costs cannot be recovered even if you shut down. That $600 million spent on a hyper-specialized chip-making plant mentioned in the text, if the chip becomes obsolete and the company shuts down, they can't sell that plant for anything near $600 million. It's basically scrap. The initial outlay is sunk.
Got it. So fixed costs are tied to operating, sunk costs are tied to expenditures already made and unrecoverable.
Correct. Though firms often amortize large sunk capital expenditures over many years for accounting purposes, spreading the cost out. And they might treat that annual amortization charge like a fixed cost. That's okay for long-term planning. as long as managers remember the original outlay is truly sunk if things go south.
The readings gave a nice contrast of cost structures across industries. Example 7.2.
Yeah, that was helpful. A PC manufacturer, mostly variable cost components, assembly labor costs, track output very closely.
A pizzeria.
Mostly fixed costs, at least in the short run. Rent, the big pizza ovens, the owner's time, maybe. Costs don't change much whether they sell 10 pizzas or 100,
And software.
dominated by sunk costs. Huge upfront R&D to develop the code. Once it's written, the cost of making one more copy, variable cost, is almost zero. But that initial investment is massive and largely unrecoverable if the software flops. These different structures lead to very different pricing and output strategies.
Okay, let's get into the standard cost curves now, focusing on the short run where capital is fixed. We have total cost, TCCR, which is simply fixed cost plus variable cost, FIXI plus VCF.
Right. And from total cost, we derive the averages. Average fixed cost, AFC equals FCQ. Average variable cost, VDC equals VCQ. And average total cost, ATCQ plus AVC plus AVCU.
But the really key one for deciding how much to produce is marginal cost.
Absolutely. Marginal cost is the increase in total cost that results from producing one more unit of output. Since fixed costs don't change with output, MC is also the increase in variable cost from one more unit. MC equals delta TCS, delta VC, delta Q.
And here's where we link cost back to production technology.
Yes, this is crucial. Remember our short-run production with fixed capital and variable labor. If labor is the only variable input and the wage rate is $1, then the marginal cost is directly related to the marginal product of labor, MPL tool.
How so?
Think about it. To produce one more unit of output, delta Q is on a 1. How much extra labor do you need? You need $1 MPL units of labor. For instance, if the marginal product of the next worker is 2 units of output, you need half a worker's time to get 1 extra unit.
Okay.
And how much does that extra labor cost? It costs the wage rate times the amount of extra labor. So MC equal delta W times 1 MPL. The fundamental link is MC equals W MPL does.
Wow. Okay. MC equals WMPL doll. So marginal cost depends inversely on marginal product.
Precisely. This is a profoundly important equation. When the marginal product of labor is high, early on specialization effects, you need very little extra labor to get more output, so marginal cost is low.
But when diminishing returns set in and MPL dollar starts to fall.
You need more and more extra labor to squeeze out that next unit of output. Since you pay each unit of labor the same wage, dollar, your marginal cost, WMPL dollar, starts to rise sharply.
And that's why the short-run cost curves, MC, AVC, ATC, are typically U-shaped.
Exactly. Initially, increasing marginal product, MPL rising, leads to falling marginal cost. Then, diminishing marginal product, MPL falling, leads to rising marginal cost.
And the averages follow the marginal.
The marginal always leads the average. When MPL is below AVC or ATCC, it pulls the average down. When MPL rises above AVC or ATCA, it pulls the average up. Therefore, the MPL curve must intersect both the AVCA and ATC curves at their respective minimum points. You can see this clearly in Figure 7.1.
And that gap between ATC and AVC.
That's just the average fixed cost. Since AVC, UFC, and failure is constant, AVC declines continuously as output increases. That's why the ATCA and AVC curves get closer together as output rises.
All right, short-run costs nailed down, linked to diminishing returns. Now back to the long run in Section 4. Total flexibility. Firms choose the optimal mix of tolerant dollars, but first, we need a better handle on the cost of capital. It's not just the purchase price. Right. We need the user cost of capital, usually denoted by FRAIR. This is especially important for large, long-lasting capital assets like that $150 million Boeing 777 example in the text. You can't just expense $150 million in year one. You need to annualize the cost of using that capital.
So what goes into R?
2 main components. First, economic depreciation. That's the actual decline in the market value of the asset over the year due to wear and tear or obsolescence. Second, the opportunity cost of the funds tied up in the asset.
Meaning the interest you could have earned.
Exactly. If that $150 million wasn't tied up in a plane, the firm could have invested it elsewhere and earned, say, a 10% return, $15 million. That foregone return is part of the annual cost of owning the plane. So $3, economic depreciation, plus interest rate value of capital.
That feels like something public sector budgeting often misses, the opportunity cost of taxpayer funds tied up in capital projects.
It's a common oversight. They might track depreciation, but often ignore the foregone return on the public's capital. Anyway, in competitive markets, this user cost R is typically equal to the rental rate someone would charge to lease that same piece of capital. So we often just talk about W for wage and R for the rental rate of capital.
Okay, so we have the price of labor and the price
Okay.
of capital. How does the firm find the cost-minimizing combination of level dollars in the long run?
They use a tool analogous to the consumer's budget line, the ISO line.
ISO meaning equal, so equal cost.
Precisely. An ISO line shows all the different combinations of labor and capital that can be purchased for a specific given total cost, $2. The equation is straightforward. $2 equals WL plus RK dose.
Just like the budget line equation and its slope.
If you rearrange that equation to solve for K, KECR, WRL, you see the slope is WROL. It's simply the negative, the ratio of the input prices, wage rate to rental rate.
Okay, so we have isoquants showing output levels and isocost lines showing cost levels. How do they combine for cost minimization?
Geometrically, it's quite elegant. To find the lowest cost way to produce a specific target level of output, say it's W1, represented by isoquant 1, the firm needs to find the lowest possible isocost line that still touches that isoquant.
Which happens where they are just tangents.
Exactly. As shown in figure 7.3, the cost-minimizing input combination occurs at the point where the chosen isocost line is precisely tangent to the target isoquant. At that point, they have the same slope.
So the slope of the isoquant, which is MRTS up, must equal the slope of the isocost line, which is double below.
Right, which means the condition for cost minimization is MRTS equals WR dollar.
Okay, MRTS equals MPL MPK. So if we substitute that in,
You get the absolute cornerstone rule for efficient production, MPL MPK equals WR, W equal WR do, or rearranging it slightly, which is often more intuitive, MPLW equals MPKR do.
MPLW equals MPKR dollar. That looks important, but maybe a bit dense. Can you translate that into plain English? What does that equality actually mean for a manager?
It's the bang for your buck rule. It means that to minimize costs, the last dollar spent on hiring labor must generate exactly the same amount of additional output as the last dollar spent on renting capital.
Okay, break that down.
Imagine if spending $1 more on labor gives you, say, 5 extra units of output, MPLW equals 5. But spending $1 more on capital only gives you 2 extra units of output, MPKR equals 2.
The firm is getting more output per dollar from labor.
Way more. They're wasting money on capital relative to labor. To minimize costs, they should immediately hire more labor and use less capital.
Until
The marginal product of labor falls due to diminishing returns, and the marginal product of capital rises as it becomes scarcer relative to labor, to the point where the output per dollar is equalized, MPLW equals MPKRR. At that point, there's no way to reshuffle spending between inputs to get the same output for less cost. You've found the minimum.
That is powerful, and it has direct implications for policy tools like taxes or regulations that change input prices.
Absolutely. Let's take that effluent fee example. Example 7.4. Suppose the government wants to reduce water pollution from a factory. Wastewater discharge can be thought of as an input the factory uses.
Okay.
If the government imposes a fee, essentially a tax, on each gallon of wastewater discharged, it sharply increases the effective price of using that polluting input.
So the Trotter ratio changes. The price of the polluting input goes up relative to other inputs like labor or capital for pollution abatement equipment.
Right. The isocost line relative to the wastewater input axis becomes much steeper. The cost-minimizing firm, following the MDPI rule, now finds that the marginal product per dollar spent on discharging wastewater is much lower than the marginal product per dollar spent on, say, installing treatment equipment.
So they have an economic incentive to change their input mix.
A strong incentive. They will move along their isoquant to keep producing the same output to a new tangency point, like from A to B in the diagram. They will substitute away from the now expensive polluting input, less wastewater, and towards the relatively cheaper input, more capital in the form of treatment gear.
So policy analysts can use this framework knowing the firm's technology, the MRTS, and the input price changes to predict how much pollution reduction a given fee will likely achieve.
Exactly. It's a core tool for designing efficient environmental regulation.
Now, if we track all these cost-minimizing tangency points as the firm decides to produce more output, moving to higher isoquants, what do we get?
That trace of tangency points forms the firm's expansion path, shown in figure 7.6a. It shows the optimal combination of $, and dollar the firm will use for every possible output level in the long run, given fixed input prices.
And from that path, showing the input quantities, we can directly figure out the cost.
Yes, for each point on the expansion path, you know the optimal $, and dollars. You multiply by their prices and sum them up, tlitzarke rote, to get the minimum total cost for that output level. Plotting that minimum cost against output gives you the long-run total cost curve shown in figure 7.6b.
Okay. Now, related to long-run costs, we have these terms: returns to scale and economies of scale. They sound similar. Are they the same?
Related but distinct. Returns to scale is a purely technical concept related to the production function itself. It asks, what happens to output if you increase all inputs by the same proportion, say double them?
So double dollars and double dollars.
Right. If output more than doubles, you have increasing returns to scale. Often happens at smaller scales due to greater specialization or physical advantages, like volume increasing faster than surface area for pipes or tanks.
If output exactly doubles?
Constant returns to scale.
And if output less than doubles?
Decreasing returns to scale. This often happens at very large scales due to coordination problems, communication breakdowns, managerial inefficiencies. It gets harder to manage enormous organizations.
Okay, that's returns to scale, proportional input changes. What about economies of scale?
Economies of scale is a cost concept. It refers to a situation where a firm can double its output for less than double the cost.
Ah, so it's about cost efficiency, not just physical output ratios.
Exactly. Economies of scale can arise from increasing returns to scale, but also from other things. For example, a larger firm might be able to negotiate bulk discounts on inputs or use specialized capital that only makes sense at high volumes. Crucially, achieving economies of scale might involve changing the proportions of inputs, not just scaling them proportionally, like switching to a more capital-intensive technology as you grow.
So economies of scale is a broader concept.
Generally, yes. The opposite is diseconomies of scale, where doubling output requires more than double the cost. This often coincides with decreasing returns to scale due to those managerial issues.
How do we measure these scale economies?
The key metric is the cost-output elasticity. It measures the percentage change in cost, resulting from a 1% increase in output. Mathematically, it's calculated as the ratio of marginal cost to average cost.
Yeah.
EC equals MC ACT.
What does it tell us?
It tells us directly about scale economies. If EC dollar, it means EC DOP is less than EC day. This only happens when EC time is falling. So EC dividend indicates economies of scale.
Okay, if EC double.
Then ET dollars is greater than EC, which means AT must be rising. EC double indicates diseconomies of scale.
And EC double is...
EC equals EC. This occurs at the minimum point of the average cost curve. There are neither economies nor diseconomies of scale at that specific output level. This elasticity is a really practical tool for managers asking, is our firm currently too small or too large?
And this pattern, economies of scale at first, then possibly diseconomies, is what gives the long-run average cost curve its typical U-shape.
Exactly. The LAC Tower curve, like in figure 7.9, slopes downward when economies of scale dominate. Specialization, input prices, efficient capital use hits a minimum and then may slope upward if diseconomies of scale kick in. Coordination costs, bureaucracy.
Finally, let's connect the long run back to the short run. How do the LAC and the various short-run average cost LAC curves relate?
The LAC curve is the envelope of all the possible SOLA curves, figure $7.10s. Each cell curve represents the costs for a specific fixed level of capital, like Cellica 1 for plant size, Cana 1, Celsitor for plant size, Cana 2, etc.
Yeah.
The LAC curve shows the lowest possible average cost for producing any given output level when you are free to choose the optimal plant size.
So the LAC touches each cell two but is generally below them.
It touches each silicon at just one point. At any other output level, the Celca will lie above the LACA. This shows the cost penalty of inflexibility in the short run.
How so?
Suppose a firm is operating with plant size K-1 and wants to temporarily increase output significantly. In the short run, they're stuck with K-1. They have to hire lots more labor, pushing them up their say K-dollar curve to a high-cost point, like point P.
In the long run?
In the long run, if they plan to produce that higher output level permanently, they would have chosen a larger, more appropriate plant size, say 22.2. This would put them on a different short-run curve, but allow them to produce that higher output at the minimum possible long-run average cost, right on the LAC DOE curve. The gap between point P and the LAC dollar represents the extra cost incurred due to short-run inflexibility.
Okay, we've covered the core single-product firm extensively, but many firms produce more than one thing. Let's move into Section 5, which looks at some more specialized dynamics, starting with economies of scope.
Right. Economies of scope exist when it's cheaper for a single firm to produce two or more different products jointly than it would be for separate firms to produce each product on its own.
So producing cars and trucks together in one company might be cheaper than having a separate car company and a separate truck company.
Potentially, yes. Or think about a university that does both teaching and research, or a hospital doing patient care and medical training. There might be shared inputs or capabilities.
Like what?
Shared management, maybe a common administrative staff, shared marketing or distribution networks, using the same machinery for parts of different products, maybe knowledge spillovers between product lines.
How do we visualize this?
We use the product transformation curve,
Huh.
figure 7.1 on. It shows the different combinations of two outputs, say cars and tractors, that can be produced with a amount of inputs, labor and capital.
And its shape tells us about scope economies.
Often, yes. If the curve is bowed outward, concave to the origin, it suggests that the resources are more effectively used when producing a mix of both goods, rather than specializing entirely in one. This often indicates economies of scope are present.
Is there a way to measure it, like the elasticity for scale economies?
There is. The degree of economies of scope calculates the percentage cost saving from joint production. The formula looks at the cost of producing good 1 alone, CQ1 dollars, plus the cost of producing good 2 alone, compares that sum to the cost of producing them together, CQ1 go 2, QO2, and expresses the savings relative to the joint cost.
So CQ1 plus CQ1Q2, CQ1Q2 dollar if that's positive.
If CC dollars, then economies of scope exist, the joint cost is less than the sum of the separate costs. If CQ1 $1, there are diseconomies of scope, it would actually be cheaper to produce them separately.
The trucking example from the text, example 7.6, illustrated this.
Right. Trucking firms that handle both specific direct long hauls and less urgent consolidated shipments can often achieve economies of scope. They can use their scheduling systems, logistics expertise, and terminal facilities more efficiently by coordinating both types of services to minimize empty backhauls and optimize routes.
Though the advantage might diminish for really huge firms.
Yes, like scale economies, scope economies can also run into limits, perhaps due to increasing complexity.
Okay, so that's joint production. What about cost changes that happen over time dynamically?
This brings us to another really important concept, especially for new industries or complex manufacturing: the learning curve.
Learning curve. This isn't about economies of scale.
No, it's distinct, though often confused. Economies of scale relate cost reductions to the current rate of output per time period. The learning curve relates cost reductions to the cumulative output over the firm's entire history.
Cumulative output, so the total number of units ever produced.
Exactly. The idea is that as firms produce more and more of a product over time, they simply get better at it. Their workers gain experience and become faster and more effective, learning by doing. Managers figure out better ways to schedule production flows. Engineers identify incremental design improvements that simplify manufacturing. Even suppliers might become more efficient as they produce more components for the firm.
So the cost of producing the 1,000th unit is lower than the cost of the 10th unit, simply because the organization has learned so much by producing the first 999.
Precisely. This leads to declines in both average and marginal costs as cumulative output increases. The typical model shown, figure 7.1 to 7.13, suggests that the labor input required per unit of output falls as cumulative output rises, often following a formula like A plus B and B dash.
So how do we visualize the difference between learning and scale economies on a cost curve graph?
Think of it this way, as in figure 7.13. Economies of scale involves moving along a given average cost curve. If you increase your production rate from 0.27, you might slide down the AC delta 1 curve from point A to point B, reducing average cost due to scale.
Okay, and learning.
Learning involves shifting the entire average cost curve downward. As your cumulative output grows over time, say from $N to $202, your average cost curve shifts from AC $101 down to AC $2. So even if you're still producing at the same rate, $2, your cost falls from point A to point C because of the accumulated experience.
This seems incredibly important for industries like aerospace, defense, or even software development.
Absolutely critical. The source mentions aircraft assembly, figure 7.14. The cost, particularly the labor hours, required to build the first few units of complex new aircraft is astronomical. But the hours required for the 100th or 200th plane are dramatically lower due to massive learning effects.
What are the implications for, say, government procurement?
It means governments need to understand that the high price tag on the initial units of a new defense system, for example, isn't just the cost of those units. It's an investment in the learning that will dramatically lower the cost of all subsequent units. You have to factor in the entire learning curve.
And for private firms?
Firms in new technology-intensive markets might strategically choose to ramp up production very quickly, maybe even selling at a loss initially, just to move down the learning curve faster than competitors. Gaining that cumulative experience can create a powerful, long-lasting cost advantage.
Like Tesla with electric cars, perhaps, pushing volume early on.
That's a plausible interpretation. Drive cumulative output, drive learning, lower long-term costs. The text mentions studies in the chemical processing industry found that the vast majority of cost reductions over decades, something like 85%, were attributed to learning effects, industry-wide cumulative output, rather than just firms getting bigger, economies of scale.
Wow. So experience really counts in a quantifiable cost sense.
It really does. Learning effects can be a major driver of productivity growth and competitive advantage. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, that was quite a journey through the producer's world. A real deep dive. We started with that fundamental question from Coase: why do firms even exist?
Move through the physical realities of production, the limits imposed by diminishing returns.
Then we built up the cost side, emphasizing that crucial difference between accounting cost and the forward-looking economic cost, especially opportunity cost, and the need to ignore sunk costs.
Right. And then we developed the core analytical engine for the long run, isoquants mapping the technology, isocost lines showing the budget, culminating in that key cost minimization rule. MRTS equals WRT, or even better, MPLW equals MPKR1. Get the same bang for your buck from the last dollar spent on any input. That really is the driving principle behind rational resource allocation.
And it's not just for private companies chasing profit. As we discussed, this framework applies just as much to public sector managers trying to deliver services efficiently. That city waste department deciding between more trucks or more workers, they're implicitly or hopefully explicitly trying to solve that MPP equation to minimize cost for taxpayers.
Exactly. The logic is universal for any organization trying to achieve an objective with limited resources.
So maybe to wrap up, let's leave our listeners with a provocative thought, something connecting this theory directly back to the policy analysis focus of PP 5375.
Okay. Consider a major policy intervention aimed at climate change. Let's say a significant carbon tax is implemented. Think about this tax through the lens of our cost minimization equation.
Okay, so the carbon tax effectively increases the price of using carbon-intensive energy, which is an input for many firms.
Right? Relative to other inputs like labor or capital investment in renewable energy technology or energy efficiency for clean capital, the price ratio, or carbon, shifts dramatically.
So the theory, MRTS equals WR2, dictates that firms must react to stay cost competitive.
They must. To minimize costs, they're now economically incentivized to substitute away from the expensive tax carbon input and towards relatively cheaper inputs, investing in solar panels, upgrading insulation, changing processes. They need to find a new tangency point on their isoquant.
So the provocative question is,
How quickly and how much substitution would actually occur? The theory tells us the direction, but the magnitude and speed depend entirely on the firm's underlying production technology, specifically their MRTS.
if it's easy for them to substitute between energy types and capital, a high MRTS or relatively flat isoquant in that region, then the carbon tax could be very effective very quickly, driving significant shifts to cleaner inputs.
Precisely.
But if their production process is closer to fixed proportions, L-shaped isoquants,
Meaning it's technologically difficult or impossible to substitute away from the carbon input in the short to medium term.
Then the tax might just raise their costs without changing their behavior much, at least initially. It might just get passed on to consumers or reduce profits without the desired environmental effect.
Exactly. So the effectiveness of a policy tool like a carbon tax hinges critically on the technological flexibility of the firms being regulated on the shape of their isoquants, their MRTS. Understanding the production side is absolutely essential for designing policies that actually work as intended.
That's a fantastic point to end on. It really highlights the practical power of understanding these theoretical concepts.
It's all connected. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into production and production costs. Hopefully this helps solidify these crucial concepts. Until next time, keep thinking about how to optimize those scarce resources.